Alright guys, I did not want to be making this video today, but I have to. Because something huge, something genuinely serious just happened, and it's the kind of news that changes the entire tone of this war. 2 American service members were just killed in action, and a third is missing. This is the first time we've lost American troops in this conflict since back in March. So today, out of respect, I want to walk you through exactly what we know, what led up to this, and what it means going forward. Hey everybody, it's Ryan on the Max Afterburner channel, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot. I've flown the Boeing 737, the Airbus A220, flown airliners for many years. And before I get into the breakdown today, I just want to say my heart goes out to the families of these 2 service members and to the family of the one still listed as missing. I've spent my entire career around people who put on the uniform and accept that risk every single day. And anytime we lose someone, that's not just a headline, that's someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's husband or wife, someone's parent. So let's walk through this respectfully and accurately. So here's exactly what U.S. Central Command confirmed. On July 17th, 2 U.S. service members in Jordan were killed in action as CENTCOM and partner forces defended against an Iranian ballistic missile and drone attack. Additionally, 1 more service member is currently listed as missing in action. 4 other American service members were medically evacuated to hospitals in Jordan, and the good news there is all 4 have since been discharged. And other personnel who were evaluated for minor injuries have already returned to duty. Following standard Department of Defense policy, CENTCOM is withholding the identities of the 2 fallen service members until 24 hours after their next of kin have been notified. And that's exactly the right call. That's how it should be done, giving those families the space and the dignity to hear that news privately before it becomes public. I want to give you some context here because this specific location matters. Jordan has been on the receiving end of Iranian retaliatory strikes multiple times throughout this stretch of the war, alongside Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Syria, all getting hit as Iran has widened its retaliation well beyond just targeting U.S. and Israeli forces directly. Jordan's own military reported early Saturday that its air defense systems intercepted 10 separate Iranian missiles that had entered Jordanian airspace and were targeting the kingdom's territory, all shot down with no casualties or damage on that particular engagement. So even as Jordan's own defenses were successfully knocking down missile after missile, this other attack, the one that hit U.S. and partner forces, unfortunately got through, and that's where we lost these 2 service members. Let's talk about what led up to this moment, because this didn't come out of nowhere. This is now the 7th consecutive night of U.S. strikes on Iran, and CENTCOM confirmed that Stretch's most recent wave targeted surveillance sites, military logistics infrastructure, underground weapons storage, and maritime capabilities. That sustained campaign has been going on for over a week straight at this point, and Iran has been retaliating with drone and missile attacks against U.S. and partner nation targets essentially every single night in response. Iran's Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei put out a written statement accusing the United States of repeated breaches of agreements with Tehran, going as far as to say that President Trump's signature carries no value or legitimacy at this point. That's about as blunt a rejection of any remaining diplomatic framework as you're going to hear from a head of state, and it tells you just how far apart these 2 sides currently are. I also want to bring up the economic dimension here, because it's moving just as fast as the military situation. Brent crude oil prices crossed $88 a barrel on Friday. That's up around $4 in a single day, and it's the highest oil has been in about a month. Just for context on how wild these swings have gotten, prices had actually dropped down to around $71 a barrel back on July 1st, after Iran, in the US, had signed that memorandum of understanding in mid-June. But as that agreement fell apart and strikes resumed, prices have been steadily climbing right back up. On top of that, President Trump ordered a naval blockade on Iranian ports to restart this week. And CENTCOM reported it has already redirected 4 commercial ships attempting to reach Iranian ports as part of enforcing that blockade, with 1 additional ship disabled by firing on its smokestack, and another one boarded specifically to ensure full compliance. So you've got this military escalation and this economic and maritime enforcement campaign both accelerating at the exact same time. Now, let me talk about why losing American service members changes the calculus of this war so significantly, because I think this is the part that matters most going forward. Up to this point, over these past several months, this conflict has largely been fought through airstrikes, naval actions, and missile exchanges, without direct American combat casualties for a long stretch. The moment you cross that line, the moment you have actual American service members killed in action, the political and emotional weight of this entire war shifts in this country. This isn't abstract anymore. This isn't just watching footage of strikes on facilities on the other side of the world. This is American families getting the worst possible news a military family can receive. And historically, that kind of moment tends to harden public and political resolve rather than soften it. because there's now a very direct, very personal reason tied to continuing and even escalating the response. I think you should expect the rhetoric out of Washington over these next few days to reflect exactly that shift. I also want to point out, because context matters here too, that this isn't the first time we've lost American troops to an attack connected to this broader regional conflict. Back in January of last year, 3 U.S. service members were killed and dozens more injured in a drone attack on a small American outpost in Jordan near the Syrian border. That was a different phase of a related but distinct set of hostilities in the region, but it shows you Jordan has unfortunately been the site of American combat losses tied to this broader conflict more than once now. And every time that's happened, it's marked a serious escalation point in how the U.S. has responded going forward. Let me also touch on the broader pattern of retaliation Iran has been running this past week, because these American deaths didn't happen in isolation. They happened in the middle of an extremely wide multi-country exchange. Iraq reported shooting down attack drones over the city of Erbil. Air raid sirens sounded multiple times across Bahrain. Jordan intercepted that wave of 10 missiles I mentioned earlier. Kuwait and Qatar have both had to fend off fresh attacks over these same days. So what you're looking at is Iran essentially running a wide, simultaneous retaliation campaign across basically every country in the region, hosting American forces, or allied to the U.S., all at the same time, night after night. And unfortunately, on this particular night, one of those attacks got through and cost American lives. Let me walk through the blockade and the maritime enforcement piece in a bit more detail, because I think it's important to understand just how many different fronts this war is now being fought on simultaneously. The naval blockade President Trump ordered to restart this week isn't just a policy announcement. It's an active enforcement operation happening in real time. CENTCOM reported it has redirected 4 commercial ships attempting to reach Iranian ports so far, up from 3 the day before, which tells you the pace of interdiction is actually accelerating. Beyond redirection, one additional vessel was disabled entirely by firing a missile at its smokestack, a targeted way to stop a ship's propulsion without sinking it or endangering the crew, and another vessel was boarded outright specifically to ensure full compliance with the blockade. When you put that together with the strikes on logistics infrastructure we've talked about on this channel before, the bridges, the railway junctions, the power lines connecting coastal cities, what you're looking at is a coordinated campaign that's squeezing Iran from multiple directions at once, in the air, at sea, and across their internal transportation network. That kind of multi-domain pressure campaign takes an enormous amount of coordination across different branches of the military and different regional commands. And it's exactly the kind of complex operational environment where the risk of exactly what happened in Jordan becomes elevated, because you've got American and partner forces spread across so many simultaneous operations in so many different countries at the same time. I also want to spend a little more time on the oil market side of this, because I think it's one of those threads that connects directly back to why moments like today's news carry so much weight beyond the immediate human tragedy. Brent crude crossing $88 a barrel isn't just a number on a financial news ticker. It represents real strain being felt by ordinary people filling up their cars, by businesses that depend on fuel costs for shipping and production, by entire national economies that import oil and are now paying more for every barrel. And the swing we've seen, from around $71 right after the Memorandum of Understanding was signed in mid-June, back up toward $88 now as that agreement has collapsed and fighting has resumed, that's not a gradual, predictable market movement. That's the kind of volatility that makes it incredibly difficult for governments, businesses, and households anywhere in the world to plan ahead with any confidence. Every time this conflict escalates, whether that's a new round of strikes, a blockade tightening, or now, unfortunately, American casualties, you can expect markets to respond with exactly this kind of jump, because traders are constantly trying to price in the risk of further disruption to a region that still handles such an enormous share of the world's oil supply. I think it's also worth spending a little more time on what it actually looks like from an air defense standpoint when a country like Jordan is trying to shoot down an incoming wave of ballistic missiles and drones. Because I think that context helps explain both why some attacks get successfully intercepted and why, unfortunately, others get through. Ballistic missiles travel at an entirely different speed and altitude profile than drones. They can reach hypersonic speeds during their terminal descent phase, giving defenders only a matter of seconds to detect, track, and engage them before impact. Drones, on the other hand, are slower but can be much harder to detect on radar because of their small size and low altitude flight profiles. And if you're dealing with a wave of both types of threats arriving simultaneously or in close succession, that puts an enormous amount of strain on any air defense network, no matter how sophisticated. Jordan's success in shooting down all 10 of those ballistic missiles that entered their airspace earlier that same night is honestly a very impressive defensive performance. But even the best air defense systems in the world don't operate at 100% success rates against every single incoming threat, especially during a sustained high-volume retaliation campaign like the one Iran has been running against multiple countries simultaneously over this past week. That's simply the harsh reality of layered air defense against a determined high-volume attacker. And it's exactly why American and partner forces, stationed throughout this region, have been operating under such an elevated, persistent threat level for months now. Let me also talk a little more about what a moment like this typically means for military families and for the broader military community, because I think it's worth explaining for anyone watching who hasn't spent time around that world. When CENTCOM withholds the identities of fallen service members for 24 hours after next of kin notification, that's not bureaucracy for its own sake. That's a deliberate, carefully protected process designed to make sure that a family learns about the loss of their loved one from a uniformed casualty notification officer in person with the appropriate support in place, rather than from a news alert on their phone or a stranger online speculating about who might have been involved. That process exists because of hard lessons learned over decades about the absolute worst way a family can receive this kind of news, and every single person in that notification chain, from the officers assigned to deliver that message to the chaplains and support staff who follow up in the days and weeks after, takes that responsibility with an enormous amount of gravity. And in military communities, whether that's a specific unit, a base, or even just the broader community of veterans and families who've served, news like this tends to ripple outward immediately, well before any names become public, because everyone with a loved one currently deployed anywhere in that region feels that fear and that uncertainty in a very immediate, personal way the moment a report like this breaks. I also want to mention, because I think it adds important context to how seriously this entire region is treating the current threat environment, that this attack in Jordan happened as part of an extraordinarily wide, simultaneous retaliation effort spanning multiple countries in a single night. We're talking about Iraq shooting down drones over Erbil, air raid sirens sounding repeatedly across Bahrain, Jordan intercepting that wave of 10 ballistic missiles, and Kuwait and Qatar both having to fend off fresh attacks within that same general window. When you're defending against that volume and that geographic spread of incoming threats simultaneously across an entire region, using air defense networks that ultimately depend on human operators making split-second decisions under enormous pressure, the odds that every single engagement goes perfectly, every single night, across every single country, were never going to be 100%, no matter how good the technology or how well trained the crews. That's simply the mathematics of sustained, high-intensity, multi-front warfare, and it's part of why a moment like today, painful as it is, has honestly felt like something the region has been bracing for as this conflict has continued to intensify week after week. I mentioned earlier that this isn't the first time Jordan has been the site of American losses connected to this broader regional conflict, and I want to spend a bit more time on that parallel because I think it's instructive for understanding how these moments tend to shape what comes next. Back in January of last year, a drone attack on a small American outpost near the Syrian border killed 3 service members and injured dozens more, and at the time, that attack was described as the first American combat deaths tied to that specific chapter of regional hostilities. What followed in the aftermath of that attack was a significant escalation in the American response, a broader campaign of strikes against the specific networks believed responsible, and a period of intense public and political attention on exactly the kind of questions we're likely to see raised again in the coming days, questions about troop posture in the region, about what additional protective measures need to be taken, and about whether the current strategy adequately accounts for the risk American forces are being asked to accept. I don't say this to suggest today's news will play out in exactly the same way. Every situation is different, and the broader context of this current war is different from what was happening back then. But I think it's a useful historical parallel for understanding the kind of policy conversation that tends to follow a moment like this. I also want to take a minute to talk about what it actually means, from a pure military operations standpoint, to defend against Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks the way partner forces did in this specific engagement. Because I think understanding the mechanics helps convey just how much genuine skill and composure it takes to do this job under fire. When you're on the ground manning an air defense system, or you're part of a base's protective detail during an incoming missile and drone barrage, you are operating under some of the most stressful conditions. Imaginable, split-second decisions, incomplete information about exactly what's inbound and from where, and the full knowledge that any mistake, any moment of hesitation, could cost lives, including your own. The fact that 4 of the American service members involved in this specific engagement were able to be medically evacuated, treated, and have since been discharged from the hospital, and that other personnel with minor injuries have already returned to duty, tells you that even in the middle of an attack serious enough to cost 2 lives and leave a 3rd service member missing, the response and the medical support on the ground functioned effectively enough to save a number of other lives that could very easily have been lost as well. That's a testament to the training, the medical readiness, and the sheer professionalism of everyone involved in that response, even on what was clearly one of the hardest nights this specific deployment has faced. I think it's also worth addressing, honestly and directly, the uncertainty hanging over the status of the missing service member, because I don't want to gloss past that in this breakdown. Being listed as missing in action is an agonizing status for everyone involved, for the command trying to locate and account for that individual, and most of all for that person's family, who are left waiting for information in what is undoubtedly one of the hardest periods any military family can go through. Search and recovery efforts in situations like this typically involve an enormous, sustained effort, drawing on every available resource, because the military's commitment to accounting for every single service member, whether they come home safely, are confirmed among the fallen, or remain unaccounted for, is one of the most deeply held values across every branch of the armed forces. I don't have additional information beyond what CENTCOM has released, and I'm not going to speculate beyond that, but I wanted to acknowledge directly that this status, missing in action, carries its own specific weight. And I think all of us watching this channel should be holding out hope for that service member's safe recovery. Let me also say something about the broader emotional toll this kind of sustained conflict takes, not just on the families directly affected by a loss like today's, but on the entire military community, and honestly, on the broader public following this war closely. We are now 7 consecutive nights into active strikes, with retaliation happening across half a dozen countries simultaneously nearly every single night. That is an exhausting, relentless pace, not just physically for the service members directly involved, but emotionally for everyone connected to this conflict in some way, families with loved ones deployed, veterans who've served in that region themselves and know exactly what that environment feels like, and civilians on every side who are living through the kind of sustained uncertainty that comes with a war that shows no clear signs of a fast resolution. I think it's important, especially on a day like today, to acknowledge that toll honestly, rather than just moving straight into strategic analysis as if this is purely an abstract exercise in understanding military tactics and geopolitics. Okay, let me give you my take here as a professional pilot, and honestly, just as someone who's spent a career around people who wear this country's uniform. Number one, I think this moment, the first American combat deaths in this specific phase of the conflict since March, is going to function as a serious turning point in how this war gets discussed and prosecuted going forward. Wars have a way of staying somewhat abstract to the public until American service members start coming home in flag-draped coffins. And once that happens, the tolerance for a long, grinding, uncertain conflict tends to drop sharply, while the appetite for a faster, more decisive resolution tends to rise. I would not be surprised to see the pace and intensity of U.S. operations increase in the immediate aftermath of this loss, not decrease. And I think we'll likely see political leaders on both sides of the aisle here at home weighing in over the coming days with very strong statements about how this administration should respond. Number two, I think this underscores just how dangerous and unpredictable this current phase of the war has become for American forces stationed throughout the region, even in countries like Jordan that aren't direct combatants in the underlying dispute. When Iran is launching retaliatory strikes across 5 or 6 different countries on any given night, every single American service member stationed anywhere in that region is potentially in the blast radius of an attack aimed at a completely different objective. That's an incredibly difficult environment to operate in, and it's a genuine tribute to the air defense crews and the service members on the ground that we haven't seen losses like this more frequently given the sheer volume of missiles and drones being fired across the region on a near nightly basis at this point. I think anyone trying to understand the true scope of the risk currently being managed by American and partner forces across this region needs to sit with that reality for a moment, because it's easy to read a headline about a single attack in a single country and miss just how sprawling and constant this threat picture has become across the entire theater. Number three, and I think this is honestly the most important point I can leave you with today, every single number, every strike count, every target list, every barrel of oil price we talk about on this channel, all of that exists in service of protecting real people, American service members and their families, and civilians caught in the crossfire on every side of this conflict. Today, that cost became very real and very personal for 2 American families, and I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost underneath all the strategic analysis. There's a tendency, especially in this kind of coverage, to talk about strikes and casualty numbers and geopolitical strategy in a way that can start to feel abstract, almost clinical, and I think today is a good reminder that behind every single one of those numbers is a real person, with a real family, real friends, a real life that was interrupted by this conflict. I try to bring the technical and strategic breakdown on this channel because I think understanding how and why these things happen genuinely matters, but I never want that analysis to come at the expense of remembering the human cost sitting underneath all of it. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge everyone currently serving in that region right now, not just the service members directly involved in this specific engagement, but everyone stationed across Jordan, Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and every other location where American and partner forces are currently operating under this kind of sustained, elevated threat. Every single one of those service members went to work today and every day this week, knowing full well the level of risk they were accepting, and they did their jobs anyway, because that's what the uniform represents. I think it's easy, watching this conflict unfold from the comfort of wherever you're watching this video right now, to lose sight of just how much courage it takes to show up for a deployment like that, night after night, especially during a stretch as intense as this past week has been. So to every service member currently serving in that theater, thank you, and please stay safe. I'm not going to do my usual closing today, guys. I'm not going to ask you to smash the like button or tell you to check out another video right after this one. If you want to support the people affected by days like today, consider looking into organizations that support Gold Star families and the families of service members currently missing in action. I'll try to put some resources in the description below. Please keep these families and every family who's lost someone in this conflict in your thoughts. This is Ryan, Max Afterburner, signing off.